Abraham Lincoln's political career was not a meteoric rise to glory, but rather a series of choreographed stumbles that would have discouraged anyone without a superhuman tolerance for failure and a rather twisted sense of humor. Before becoming the savior of the Union, Lincoln was a provincial lawyer in Illinois who seemed to collect electoral defeats as easily as others collect stamps. His first attempt to enter the Illinois state legislature ended in a 13th place finish out of 13 candidates. In sporting terms, Abraham wouldn't even have qualified for the playoffs, but in his mind, that defeat was just a slight logistical inconvenience. What truly defined his rise was not his ability to win at first, but his ability to turn every failure into a funny anecdote that people ended up voting for him just to see what story he would tell after the next fall. It all started in New Salem, a town today barely a memory, where Lincoln tried everything: store clerk, woodcutter, and even a militia captain in a war against Native Americans where, in his own words, the only blood he shed was his own, fighting against armies of hungry mosquitoes. In New Salem, Lincoln partnered with a man named William Berry to open a grocery store, a business that failed so miserably it left him with a debt he himself called the national debt, taking almost 15 years to pay it off. It was during this era of commercial failures that he understood that in frontier politics, logic mattered, but a good story about a farmer and a stubborn pig mattered much more. His real entry into the social fabric began in the circuit courts, where he traveled from town to town on horseback, with his long legs hanging almost to the ground. These trips were not only to practice law, but to build a network of contacts who saw him as the man who could resolve a boundary dispute and, at the same time, make the entire jury laugh until they forgot about the convicting evidence. One of the most revealing episodes of his political cunning occurred with the Clary's Grove Boys, a gang of local thugs who terrified political candidates. Instead of giving them a speech on civic ethics, Lincoln accepted a wrestling match against their leader, Jack Armstrong. After shaking the local giant and throwing him through the air, Lincoln not only won the respect of the thugs, but turned them into his first electoral agents. Those men went from crashing his rallies to ensuring that no one else dared to interrupt Honest Abe. It was his first great lesson in political realism. Sometimes, for your ideas to be heard, you first have to prove you can lift a man over your head. Jack Armstrong became his lifelong friend, proving that Lincoln had the gift of turning his physical enemies into political assets before the first round ended. His jump to the Illinois state legislature in 1834 was the result of this mix of physical strength and rural charisma. Lincoln walked miles to shake hands, but he did it with a peculiar technique. He would arrive at farms, help owners harvest or move logs, and only then mention he was on the ballot. He didn't ask for the vote, he asked for permission to help, and that form of political marketing, based on shared sweat, was impossible to defeat for the city candidates who wore silk. Once in the legislative power in Vandalia, Lincoln became the leader of a faction known as the Long Nine, a group of legislators who all stood over 6 feet 4 inches tall. Using his imposing physical presence and a negotiation technique known as log rolling, that is, a casual clarification, that exchange of favors where I vote for your bridge if you vote for my road, Lincoln achieved the impossible, moving the state capital to Springfield. It was his first doctorate in the art of parliamentary manipulation under the guise of a clueless rustic. But the road to Washington was a journey full of mines that he took it upon himself to step on. In 1846, after years of insistence, Lincoln finally achieved a seat in the United States Congress. Anyone would have tried to go unnoticed in their first year, but Abraham, with his usual lack of self-preservation instinct, decided to directly attack President James K. Polk over the war with Mexico. He presented the famous spot resolutions, demanding that the president point to the exact spot where American blood had been shed to justify the invasion. It was a movement of impeccable technical audacity, but a total political disaster in an era of burning nationalism. In Illinois, they called him a traitor and spotted Lincoln. His career seemed dead and buried at 40 years old. He retired to Springfield, apparently defeated, dedicating himself to studying the elements of Euclid to learn how to construct logical arguments that were, in his words, foolproof. During this forced retirement, Lincoln not only learned geometry, but he learned to wait. What his enemies didn't understand is that Lincoln was using that time of exile to sharpen his mental tools. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act threatened to expand slavery, Lincoln returned to the political arena as a transformed man. He was no longer just the joke-teller, but the relentless logician. In 1858, he challenged the powerful Stephen Douglas for the Senate in a series of debates that defined the country's future. Douglas arrived in towns on a private train with cannons firing salvos, projecting an image of imperial power. Lincoln, on the contrary, arrived in freight cars or walking along dusty paths, presenting himself as the man who understood the fatigue of workers. During these debates, Douglas, desperate at Lincoln's logic, accused him of being two-faced. Lincoln, unfazed, turned toward the crowd and asked, "Honestly, if I had another face, do you think I'd be using this one?" The crowd's laughter completely disarmed Douglas's attack. Although Lincoln technically lost the Senate election due to the composition of the state legislature, his speeches were printed and read all over the country. He had lost the battle for Illinois, but had just won the war for Northern public opinion. The final rise to the presidential nomination of 1860 is a chapter from a political picaresque novel. Lincoln was not the favorite. Men like William Seward had more money, more support, and much more fame. But Abraham and his allies, known as his godfathers, played the logistics card with absolute mastery. They organized the Republican Convention in Chicago, Lincoln's territory. While Seward's delegates were outside the venue holding ostentatious parades, Lincoln's men printed thousands of fake tickets for the convention and filled the building, known as the Wigwam, with local supporters who were instructed to shout Lincoln's name every time someone paused to breathe. When the official delegates of the other candidates tried to enter, they found there was no room, and that the roar in favor of Abraham was so deafening that the undecided voted for him out of pure fear that the building would collapse on their heads. It was a takeover through volume and mischief, a democratic ambush that left East Coast elites wondering what the hell had just happened. But the last obstacle remained, convincing New York intellectuals that he was not an unmannered rustic. In February 1860, Lincoln accepted to speak at the Cooper Union. He arrived in the Big Apple wearing a suit that fit him poorly, with wrinkles that looked like maps of Illinois and hair that defied any attempt at styling. When he took the podium, the audience expected a folkloric disaster. However, Abraham delivered a speech of such devastating legal and ethical precision that, by the end, the same intellectuals who had laughed at his appearance were standing up cheering him like the party's new messiah. Abe the Rail Splitter became Lincoln the Statesman that night. It was the first successful image makeover of modern politics, achieved not through a tailor, but through an intellect that was much sharper than his clothes suggested. The electoral victory of 1860 was the result of this political fragmentation that he understood better than anyone. While the Democratic Party split into irreconcilable factions, Lincoln stood firm in the North. However, he won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote, but with a strategic majority in the Electoral College that left the country in shock. He had come to power not as a conqueror with a massive mandate, but as the survivor of a political shipwreck that he himself had helped navigate. His trip to Washington for the inauguration was a scene of pure espionage. Due to assassination threats in Baltimore, Lincoln had to travel incognito on a night train, wrapped in a cloak and wearing a different hat to hide his stature. The opposition newspapers ridiculed him mercilessly, saying he had arrived in the Capitol disguised as a grandmother to save his skin. But Lincoln didn't care about the ridicule if it allowed him to survive to take office. He entered a city that was half swamp and half battlefield, with Confederate spies on every corner and a government that was disintegrating by the minute. The Lincoln who sat for the first time in the presidential office was not the saint we see today in monuments, but a shrewd politician who knew he had to surround himself with his enemies so as not to be devoured by them. He formed a cabinet nicknamed the Team of Rivals. You know, that group of ministers composed of the same men who had been his political opponents, putting into his government all the men he had humiliated at the convention. Seward, Chase, and Bates thought they could manipulate that poor rustic, but they soon discovered that Lincoln had a will of steel wrapped in farmer stories and infinite patience that would end up wearing them all out. Lincoln had transformed a career defined by the debts of New Salem and electoral failures into the most difficult mandate in American history. He had reached the top not despite his falls, but because of them, learning that in politics, as in wrestling, the key is to use your opponent's weight to throw him out of the ring, while you keep the smile and the hat well placed. That walking office that was his hat soon filled with reports of a war that no one knew how to stop, and it was in that chaos that Lincoln deployed his true genius, the management of other people's egos. His cabinet, that team of rivals, was convinced that the poor rustic from Illinois would be a puppet in the hands of more refined minds like that of William Seward, his Secretary of State. Seward arrived at the White House with the air of a prime minister, sending Lincoln memorandums where he basically explained to him how he should do his job. Lincoln, instead of firing him, invited him to tell jokes, listened to him patiently, and with a mix of firmness and charisma, ended up turning his greatest rival into his most loyal friend. Abraham knew that on a sinking ship, it doesn't matter who wears the brightest stripes, but who knows how to plug the leaks, and he was willing to let others take the credit as long as the ship didn't go down. Lincoln's relationship with his generals during the early years of the Civil War was a tragic comedy of errors. His main commander, George McClellan, was a man who suffered from a pathology that Lincoln dubbed the slows. McClellan was an organizational genius who loved his army so much that he refused to use it for fear it would get dirty, or even worse, that it would lose a battle. Lincoln sent him letters full of biting sarcasm, asking him if, since the general wasn't using the Union Army, he could borrow it for a while. On one occasion, McClellan stood the president up in his own house to go to sleep, and Lincoln, instead of becoming enraged, simply said, "I will hold McClellan's horse if it helps us win a battle." That ability to absorb personal humiliation for the benefit of the national goal was his hidden superpower, a moral elasticity that his contemporaries mistook for weakness, but which was actually a column of steel. When he finally found a general who did want to fight, Ulysses S. Grant, Lincoln had to face the Puritans of Washington, who denounced the military man for his fondness for whiskey. Lincoln's response is one of the peaks of his ironic pragmatism. He asked to be told what brand Grant drank to send a barrel of it to all his other generals, in the hope that they too would start winning battles. Abraham was not looking for saints, he was looking for results. He understood that war was not an exercise in etiquette, but a brutal struggle for the survival of an idea. And if a drunk general was the only one capable of understanding the arithmetic of victory, Lincoln was willing to be his main liquor supplier. That same arithmetic led him to draft the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that was both an act of poetic justice and a masterly war maneuver. Lincoln knew he couldn't win with bullets alone. He needed to change the moral narrative to prevent European powers from supporting the South. He waited for the right moment, after the victory at Antietam, to launch his legal bomb. It was not an impulsive act, but the result of months of ruminating on the idea, keeping the draft in that catch-all drawer that was his hat until the political climate was right. With a single stroke of a pen, he transformed a rebellion for state rights into a crusade for human freedom, proving that the law could be as lethal as a cavalry charge if one knew how to apply it. However, the moment that best defines his mastery of language and his understanding of the American soul occurred on a Pennsylvania battlefield. The Gettysburg Address is today a sacred piece, but at the time it was an exercise in brevity that bordered on insult by the standards of the time. The keynote speaker, Edward Everett, spoke for 2 hours straight, displaying a classical erudition that bored even the stones. When Lincoln stood up, he spoke barely 272 words in less than 3 minutes. It was so fast that the photographers couldn't even prepare their heavy collodion plates. You know, that old photographic technique that required preparing wet glass plates on the spot. Lincoln returned to his seat convinced that his speech had been a failure, a bad plow. He didn't understand that in a world sick of endless speeches and senseless deaths, brevity and truth were the only possible balm. Those few words did more for the country's union than 1,000 hours of pompous rhetoric. While Lincoln managed the fate of millions, his private life in the White House was a microcosm of tenderness and tragedy. His children, Willie and Tad, turned the presidential residence into their personal playground. Lincoln, who carried the weight of thousands of daily deaths on his shoulders, found in the children's antics his only way of escape. He let them interrupt cabinet meetings to show him a goat they had found, or to ask for the official pardon of a turkey destined for Christmas dinner. When Willie died of typhoid fever in 1862, a part of Lincoln's light went out forever. He would lock himself away to cry alone on Thursdays, the day his son had died. But then he would put on his hat and return to the office to decide the future of the nation. That duality between the devastated father and the relentless commander-in-chief is what makes him such a deeply human figure. His eldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, lived under a different shadow, that of a strange statistical curse. You know, that series of improbable coincidences that seem to defy all laws of probability. Robert was not only present the night his father was assassinated, but years later he was a direct witness to the assassination of President Garfield and, decades later, of President McKinley. Robert reached the logical conclusion that his presence was a magnet for assassinations and decided to stop accepting presidential invitations for the sake of national security. This chain of tragic coincidences seems like something out of a fiction script, but it was the daily reality of a family that seemed connected by an invisible cable to the epicenter of American tragedy. Lincoln himself was no stranger to the supernatural. He was a man of premonitory dreams and disturbing visions. A few days before his death, he dreamed that he was walking through the hallways of the White House, hearing sobs. Upon entering the East Room, he saw a coffin guarded by soldiers. When he asked who had died, a guard replied, "The president. He has been assassinated." It was not the first time he had this type of experience. He used to dream of a ship sailing at full speed toward a dark shore before every major event of the war. Lincoln accepted these visions with a fatalistic resignation, as if he knew that the price of saving the country was his own life. On the night of April 14, 1865, fate closed in on him with a macabre irony. Lincoln went to Ford's Theater to see a light comedy, Our American Cousin, seeking a respite after Lee's surrender. His bodyguard, John Parker, a man with a history of indiscipline who today wouldn't pass a basic security check, left his post to go drink at a nearby tavern. It turns out that tavern was the same one where the assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was taking his last shot of courage. The empty space in front of the presidential box door was the last negligence of a war full of them. Booth, an actor who knew the play in detail, waited for the funniest line of the night to fire, knowing that the audience's laughter would camouflage the sound of the weapon. Lincoln died laughing, or at least with the echo of others' laughter in his ears, a brutal transition between the joke and eternity that summarizes his existence. After his death, Lincoln's body began a journey back to Springfield, which was almost as bumpy as his presidency. The funeral train traveled thousands of miles, while the body was subjected to constant embalming processes to stay presentable before the crowds crying at the stations. Years later, his body was nearly stolen by a gang of counterfeiters who wanted to ask for a ransom of $200,000 and the release of a fellow prisoner. The robbery was thwarted, but the shock was such that his son Robert decided that Abraham should rest under several tons of cement and steel bars. Lincoln, the man who always wanted to be close to the people, ended up buried in a concrete fortress to protect his legend from human greed. Today, Lincoln's figure has been so polished by history that we risk forgetting the real man behind the marble. He was not a perfect saint, but a shrewd politician who used dirty jokes to disarm his enemies and geometric logic to rebuild a nation. He was an inventor who never saw his ships float, a frontier fighter who ended up drafting the most beautiful prose of the 19th century, and a father who pardoned turkeys while sending armies into battle. His legacy is not only the abolition of slavery or the preservation of the Union, but the demonstration that one can be the most powerful man on earth and keeping important things inside a worn stovepipe hat. Abraham Lincoln taught us that democracy is, at its heart, a long and difficult conversation that sometimes requires a good joke, not to end in a duel to the death, and that even in the darkest night, there is always a ship sailing toward a shore that, even if it is dark, is the only possible destination for a man who dared to dream of a freedom that we still try to deserve today.